It was actually back in July that Nathan first contacted me. It's not really a Christmas film, but I thought back in the summer it was sort of, well, there's not really a great call for Christmas. I'm doing some research in this area, and of course, I don't just do it at Christmas time, but there's a certain call for this. And it's very funny, actually. I was just thinking on the way here that despite being the person who everyone thinks, oh, you're the person who does all this research on Christmas, all my neighbours have had their Christmas trees up before me, the decorations before me, the Christmas shopping. I sort of feel I'm catching up on my own season somehow. But anyway, lovely to meet everyone. And I work at the University of Kent, and my research is in the area of religion and film, or actually theology and film more generally. And then specifically, I work, as far as my latest project is concerned, on Christmas films. And also, as you'll see in the course of what I want to say this evening, I want to say something about Christmas and the category of religion. And actually, if this is a religious festival, actually, a lot of the literature on Christmas, some will say, well, it's an indissolubly Christian festival, therefore, if you're not a Christian, you have no part in any of this. And there's an atheist philosopher from America called Tom Flynn, who takes the line that actually Christmas should be boycotted because it's a Christian festival, and therefore all the accoutrements of Christmas, the Christmas tree, the Christmas turkey, the mince pies, the Christmas films, we shouldn't have anything to do with them. Go to work on Christmas Day. On the other hand, you get a lot of the literature that says, no, it's a commercial festival. It's about gift giving. It's about the economy. And therefore, nothing really that theologians should get interested in. And that's probably why I got interested in this area of discourse, because I thought, well, Christmas is a wonderfully, or not so wonderfully, paradoxical festival. There are lots of things going on at the same time. Jesus and Santa, the line between the secular and the religious seems very permeable. And that sort of worked its way into my research. In a nutshell, I suppose, the sort of thing I want to talk about this evening is how odd it is that we're supposed to be very rational people, and I'll be mentioning Steve Bruce in a moment, and we think, in terms of the secularization thesis, and we're supposed to think that we're terribly rational people, we don't believe in the magical or the irrational or the supernatural. And then you're thinking, what about those Christmas films that we all watch? Like Miracle on 34th Street or Elf or the Santa Claus, which are redolent in discourse about the mythological and the supernatural and the otherworldly. So in a way, that I think gets to the very heart of the paradox of Christmas. It's almost a sense that we indulge ourselves for a brief period, and it's a taboo to be doing this. I think it's great to be doing this even in November, December. But when you get to January, to be talking about Christmas films or Christmas more generally, or to be listening to Christmas music or watching a Christmas film does seem a taboo. So it's these sort of things that I want to try and make sense of. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I know Nathan was saying that a lot of the speakers, I was told, if you can speak for about 45 minutes, that will be wonderful. In reality, I probably will err closer towards the hour, but forgive me, and we'll hopefully have a nice con. I'm just saying that now, so look at your watch. Anyway, I put Stuart Hoover up just as an example of someone who says that there's something that's really changed, maybe particularly since the 1970s. A lot of these figures do look somewhat like Father Christmas. That's quite unintentional, but lots of religious studies academics have white beards. Anyway, which may or may not be prescient. But it's very odd that there's this sense in which it may have been the case once that we saw the realm of the religious, the realm of everything else, where the media might fit in, culture more generally, to be on different sides of a binary divide. And I suppose I'm thinking here of H. Richard Niebuhr and his work on Christ and culture that was first published in 1952. And he was somebody who thought that at the end of the day, no matter what sort of connection or interrelationship there may be, Christ equals one category and culture equaled another. There may be interrelationship, there may be a sort of free-flowing interconnection between these two, but they were clearly autonomous realms. And I would sort of move away from that and say, well, rather than simply say, you have the religious and you have everything else, I wonder whether the cultural might be a repository of, or a gateway to, a portal towards understanding the religious or the sacred in contemporary society. And I think of Clive Marsh as well, who says that at the end of the day, theologians, churchgoers go to the cinema like everybody else. So the idea that somehow there's this sort of clear divide between what a theologian does and what secular, inverted commas, people do is a complete nonsense. As he says there, people who do not profess a religious tradition nevertheless make their meaning in similar ways to those who do. I mean, we have to be careful of going down the path of saying, yes, religion is all about meaning, and films are all about meaning, therefore they're all involved in the same enterprise. That's way too general a category. But at the end of the day, there is that sense in which once we understand maybe that the location of religion might be a bit more fluid than we're prepared to countenance, then there may be some interesting findings. A lot of my own work is in the area of implicit religion, the idea that we all have commitments. And commitments can take lots of different forms. It might be involving your local parish church. It might also be involved in wrapping lots of presents or looking after your children or your grandchildren, your work commitments, going swimming, athletics. It might be a project that you're involved with. It might be reading a book. It might just be going for holidays. We all have these, and often we do these, often sort of, not so much at one and the same time, but often we all have multiple commitments. We all are passionate about things, elections, nationalism. There may be all sorts of things, you know, which views on the euro, all these sort of things which might be, which at different points will rear their heads. And I think that that's true of everything in life, that we don't sort of separate out the religious from the secular. It's with us at all times. And I think certainly at this time, at Christmas time, we're very much aware in the context of what goes on in terms of some of the films that I'll be referring to this evening, that actually sometimes it's not that clearly sort of distinguishable to say, oh, you know, you can't, there's no demarcation between the religious and the secular. It's all very much a fluid, interpenetrative and interpenetrable realm. And so I think it's very curious, really, that you have at Christmas time a potentially rich site of contemporary religiosity. The ready-made adornment of Redeemer figures. We've got Santa, we've got Scrooge. We have flying reindeer, magical elves, Lapland as a functional equivalent of the Christian heaven. There's actually a Disney film, a live-action Disney film from the mid-1980s called One Magic Christmas, where it's Father Christmas who raises from the dead. A family have lost their father. He's been killed in a tragic accident. And it's Father Christmas that they pray to, and it's Father Christmas who brings the dead back to life. And Lapland seems to be some sort of functional equivalent of the Christian heaven. It's a very peculiar film, but one that sort of is not that at odds with some of the other sort of accoutrements of Christmas that you see a lot of Christmas films bearing witness to. And I think a lot of the literature will say that there is this separation, as I've said, between what goes on in theology and the rest of culture. I'm less inclined to see things in these binary terms. I mentioned Richard Niebuhr already, and I think the model of his 5 models that he put forward back in 1952, the one that I'm personally a bit more sort of attached to is his 4th dualist, Christ and culture in paradox model, the idea that actually there are lots of sort of competing discourses at one and the same time, and that actually it's not so clear to say. I mean, I suppose to give an example, you could say that you might have clear precepts as a Christian. The Sermon on the Mount, Robin Gill, who I think is talking to you later in the year, has written on this. It might be possible to say, for example, that, you know, if you're a Christian, the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, the injunctions of the Sermon on the Mount are integral to who you are and what you believe. But if you're a business person, then quite honestly, if you follow those precepts, then you're not necessarily going to be well placed to deal in the cut and thrust world of corporate business. You might have to make negotiations and compromises. Often, I mean, Christmas is full of this as well. There's this ideal that we all look up to. It's mixed with a bit of nostalgia. It's looking forward and looking backwards. A lot of the films I'll be talking about as well are full of this, the sort of childhood reminiscences, childhood nostalgia. And there's all of that, but there's also a recognition that the world perhaps isn't quite as we'd like it to be, but we keep on hoping, we keep on believing, and we come back to it year on, year out. I remember my grandfather would often say, you know, he was 95 when he passed away just a few months ago, and he would say that that's it, no more Christmas turkey. He said, next year it's just going to be beans on toast. He said, I just can't be doing this anymore. And of course, he'd always have the Christmas turkey, and he'd always say the same thing each year. But that, in a way, is symptomatic, I think, of what Christmas is for all of us. We say, never again, it's just too much. But we hope that the next year, we know it probably realistically won't be, but we hope it's going to be an improvement on the last. And that hope, that almost that eschatology, I think, is very much integral to what we're celebrating. And then you've got Steve Bruce, another slight Father Christmas figure. who sees religion in very binary terms. That the great thing about Steve Bruce, I think Richard Dawkins is a bit similar really, is that clear sense of you know what religion is all about. It has a fixed, unchanging essence, set, unchanging properties. If it doesn't conform to this ideal form, then it's not really religious. And Steve Bruce looks at institutions and he looks at membership. So effectively, how many people go to church compared to how many people went to church 50 or 100 years ago. And if there's a decline, yes, there is a decline, then that's proof of, in Bruce's terms anyway, of secularization. My concern with this really is that if you're simply going to apprehend or measure religion in terms of its institutional presence or function, then you're missing out on some of the wider tapestry really within which religion in the modern world can be understood to function. This is a really good book, that's about 5 years old now, from Jan Jobling, who was teaching at Liverpool Hope University. And she makes the claim that the religious sensibility in the Western world is not in a process of decline, it's actually in a state of change or of transformation. And she's very good at looking at all sorts of eclectic, often media-based sort of discourses. Why are people obsessed with or as they were 20 years ago, Buffy the Vampire Slayer or The X-Files or perhaps Twilight from 5 years ago or Glee, or things that often programs which are not just sort of Doctor Who might come into this sort of orbit as well, but Harry Potter certainly does, and the Philip Pullman His Dark Materials body of novels and the films that have come from those. Whereas this sense almost in which there's something about the fantastic in popular culture, where there may be a detraditioned religious space. You may have some of the literature or the films, like the ones I've just identified, in some cases making overt use of traditional Christian symbols or thought structures or themes, but they're relocated into a frame whereby their potency, Jobling argues, is cultural rather than confessedly religious. So it's really saying here that there's the role of spirituality in modern culture, where the sort of constraints that circumscribe Steve Bruce's work with its focus on religious institutions do not apply. And she thinks that the production and the consumption of the fantastic in popular culture can offer an illuminating window onto spiritual trends and conditions. But I think that it's always quite funny in the run-up to Christmas looking at the way that even the BBC sometimes will go to town on saying what its religious output is going to be. And I was just looking at the press release from 2 years ago while I was working on my current project. And the BBC's head of religious broadcasting made the point that this year's, and it's no different now in 2015, the BBC's TV and radio output is, as always, the cornerstone of traditional religion programming over the festive period, from the warmth of Tudor Monastery Farm Christmas to Radio 4's Christmas service from Chester Cathedral, and 2 evocative Eucharist broadcasts coming live from the historic and glorious setting of Westminster Abbey. The story of Christmas is at the heart of BBC schedules this December. A very sort of substantive approach to religion, an approach that really says that there's a clear essence to what religion is, and it's going to be manifest at Christmas time in the BBC TV and radio schedules. I think it's a bit of a reductionist position because it really means that you see the presence or indeed the absence of religion based purely on the presence or absence of the institutional church. Now, this would be valid if the institutional dimension of religion were the only, or at least the preeminent, dimension of what a religion is all about, the ingredients, the constituents of what a religion is. Ninian Smart, one of the great figures in framing the category of religion in the 20th century, the sort of pioneer, the person who brought religious studies as a discipline to the UK, and where he was based in Lancaster. He puts the institutional as one of 7 other models or categories as to what religion is all about. He doesn't place them in any order of priority or importance. He also looks at the ritual, the experiential, the narrative, the doctrinal, the ethical, and so on. So it comes down to what you think religion is all about. And you've got Paul Tillich, who used this language of ultimate concern, that maybe it's not only the case that all religious actualization must be through culture, it's true that all cultural creation is inherently religious. Even a secular painting may be more religiously meaningful and potent than a painting with explicit religious subject matter. So when you go down this sort of path and we look at Christmas, I suppose religion incorporates all sorts of different aspects of religion, the meaning, community, identity, symbol system, and all of these, at a whole range of different social levels. Richard Horsley goes down this path. So it would suggest that the festival can readily claim to being innately religious. But ironically, Christmas is one festival of the year which strongly polarizes people precisely because it is seen either as inescapably secular, perhaps due to its commercialized, its consumerist pedigree, or as a quintessentially religious festival in view of its Christian origins. And I've mentioned Tom Flynn already, who wrote this book in 1993 called The Trouble with Christmas. And he espouses an atheistic critique of the Christmas festival. He takes it as a given that Christmas is nothing short of a Christian celebration. There's no holiday that's viewed by non-Christians as more representative of Christian culture. And it's so inescapably Christian-based that every facet of Christmas, from creches and carols to snowflakes and sleighs, are unequivocal emblems of Christian dominance. And therefore, he says, are going to alienate anyone who does not observe the Christian faith. So he's saying that Muslims and Buddhists and atheists are excluded, and therefore Christmas should be abandoned as a universal public holiday. I mean, actually, it's quite odd going through his critique. It's a bit like reading Dawkins's The God Delusion, where you sort of feel that there's a clear line of argumentation here. There's a clear and obvious and almost quite compelling logic to this. But at the end of the day, there are plenty of Christians who will say the same thing, that the problem with Christmas time is that, yes, the shopping frenzy, the immersion in superstitious thought, that corrosive acquisitiveness, the disappointment when peace and goodwill fail to materialize, many Christians will also be keen to forego Christmas's more crass and materialistic components. It's a bit of a stretch to assume that non-Christians would feel liberated if they no longer had to observe the festival, when what makes Christmas distinctive for many people, Christian and non-Christian alike, is the opportunity to give and receive presents, to entertain family and friends, to eat and drink, maybe to relax in front of the TV. There are lots of things going on at Christmas. It's very hard to compartmentalize any of this. And I think that a lot of the literature perhaps is too inclined not to sufficiently countenance the possibility that the secular may itself be a repository of the religious. I think I'd be inclined to want to move away from this sacred-profane binary that we see at the heart of Durkheim and Mircea Eliade as well. The sacred and profane belong to different realms. The sacred is thought to be inaccessible and incomprehensible, and so on. My preference, I think, would be to lay to rest as best we can the secularization thesis, because it has this simplistic assumption that religion in Western society is undergoing a period of escalating and irrevocable erosion. If this sort of trajectory is left to go unchallenged, then it could be said to camouflage what Lee Eric Schmidt says is an equally important story, that the sacred and the secular have been ceaselessly combined and recombined. These categories have regularly dissolved in lived experience. So the sacred and the profane as commingling realms is perhaps a better, more authentic way of trying to categorize what's really going on, not least at Christmas. And then we get on to Christmas films. And I think in the specific case of Christmas, Richard Horsley makes the instructive point that in America, it's often overlooked that the grand American holiday festival expresses and embodies community and civic affairs, whether in small towns, large cities, or the nation as a whole. And this film, Christmas with the Cranks, that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, is a really good example of how you have this almost, it's all about non-conformity, but it's about a community set in the Chicago suburbs, where a family, Luther and Nora Frank, and there are a couple who always hold this great American sort of celebration each year. Each year they have at their house, they're going to have a celebration, a Christmas party each year. You have a Roman Catholic priest who goes. He has no other function in the film other than to almost give weight to this annual sort of, Christmas shindig. And it's very funny because they decide to boycott Christmas. They effectively say, we're going to go on holiday instead. We're not going to spend all this money on Christmas. And then the townsfolk say, you can't do that because you're the only house in the street without a frosty on the rooftop. You're the only family without the lights going, blazing away incandescently all night long. You're the only family who are not opening the doors to the carol singers. And it becomes almost, in the end, they cave in. It's almost as though non-conformity actually is sort of predicated on the extent to which Christmas is all about consumerism, it's all about a shopping frenzy, it's all about almost who can outwit the neighbours. And I think it's very funny listening to Abby Day, who's one of my colleagues at Kent, who's written in a completely different context about how the period of national census data gathering every 10 years has become, for many people, a performative moment, when the act of choosing the religious category of Christian brought into being a specific sense of identity. Maybe it's similar to how in Christmas with the Cranks, social cohesion and identity comes about each December only when a particular conformist ritual is enacted. Failure to do so leads in the film to a souring of community relations and a rupture in the fabric of society. It's based on a short novel, a novella by John Grisham, but it does sort of present in stark terms an instance, I think, of what Horsley is referring to when he writes that the holidays as a whole have become a prolonged expression of the civil religion in the United States. And I think I'm inclined to want to sort of go down the path that Dale DeChant proposes in this book, The Sacred Santa, that was published in 2002, when he argues that actually Christmas is a religion in its own right. It's a religion per se. And his argument is that it's not because of its causal relationship to the Christian tradition, but he says, in place of the religious-secular dichotomy that we've just been referring to, that someone like Steve Bruce embodies, and what he calls the simplistic assumption of the secularization thesis, that somehow religion or Christianity is becoming increasingly marginalized in the West as secular institutions begin to replace it as a source of cultural meanings and values. The argument that Dale DeChant puts forward is that Christmas is the epitome of a struggle between two different religious systems. His premise is that rather than being secular and non-religious, America's late, capitalist, postmodern culture is actually intensely religious and best classified as a contemporary version of ancient cosmological religiosity. This is the idea that in the ancient world, everything depended on the cycles of nature and fertility. And today, there is an analogous ultimate sacred power in the form of the economy. He was writing this admittedly before the financial crash of 2008, but his argument has a certain logic and significance to it. He says that just as in the ancient world, one would participate in rituals and temples and shrines, we participate in similar rituals at department stores and shopping malls. And his argument is not that, is Christmas functionally secular, etc., etc., in terms of its materialist, commercialized, consumerist ethos. His argument is that actually the secular, on closer inspection, indeed our entire culture system, begins to look profoundly sacred. So we could not therefore be further away from the traditional secularization thesis. Because Christmas is the quintessence of materialism and consumption, and thus a more intense and profound version of what goes on throughout the rest of the year when the workings of the economy are paramount, then so Christmas lays claim to being the most religious event in our culture. So this may be far removed from the traditional correlation between religion and transcendence or theism, but it's no less religious for that. So the idea here is that shopping and retail spending are innately religious activities, and even, to paraphrase Paul Tillich, late capitalism's ultimate concern. It serves the ultimate power, the ultimate principle of a culture, its ground of being, its source of meaning and purpose. So already we're moving away from the idea that somehow there's this binary, this dichotomy, this sort of these two realms that cannot meet up, and saying that actually Christmas may be innately religious, but not in the way that is traditionally construed. And you certainly see this, I think, in the way that when we look at a lot of films, we can see that it's interesting how it's doesn't tend to be the case in explicitly sort of Christmas films that there's any role for the institutional church, but there are lots of things going on in these films. It's a Wonderful Life might be a really good example, actually. I mentioned here the secular as transcendental. But this sort of sense in which in It's a Wonderful Life, you've got George Bailey and his family. They never go to church. We don't see them going to church. They never mention religion. A Christmas Story as well, which didn't do quite as well in Britain as it did in America when it came out in 1983, which was full of nostalgia, set a young boy growing up in the 1940s. And again, there's a very limited role in that film for religion. Hare and Nelson say there are no crosses, no Bibles or other religious symbols often associated with Christmas. And these are not isolated examples. And the very absence of religion as traditionally configured is perhaps one of the more discernible characteristics of the genre of Christmas films. So from the very outset, you might say, well, a theology of Christmas films, which is the title of the paper this evening, that makes no sense, because if, when we look at these Christmas films, there's no role for Jesus or traditional Christianity in those films, then they are surely innately secular products. And a lot of these films, it must be said as well, do tend to get some really terrible reviews, which almost sort of makes the point. Why would a theologian be interested in watching them? Jingle All the Way, Deck the Halls. Again, it's about a war between two neighbours. Anyone seen any of these films? You know, which is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love watching these films. I make it very clear, I watch these films. But it's very funny because it's, you know, again, an example of how, you know, as long as the lights are incandescent, I think there's the conceit in Deck the Halls is, just as you can see, am I right in saying that it's the Great Wall of China that's the only man-made bit of construction that you can see from space? And there's sort of the idea here, well, if we put enough light on our rooftop, you know, we'll be able to see it from, you know, that's what it's about. It's like a very, very lame and quite, you know, absurd thing that somehow the meaning of Christmas is about sort of, you know, getting one over your neighbours. But in a way, there is something in this, and you see it in Christmas with the Cranks as well, where there's something else going on, I think, in all of these films. Because often there's this sense in which the characters are doing this maybe for love, perhaps. Jingle All the Way has got the Arnold Schwarzenegger character. He needs to show how much he loves his son by purchasing the latest Turbo Man action figure on Christmas Eve. Surviving Christmas with Ben Affleck is one of the most peculiar Christmas films of recent years. It came out in 2004, where he plays a millionaire who is so isolated and lonely at Christmas that he goes to the lengths of paying a family $250,000 to allow him to spend Christmas in their home. And in Christmas with the Cranks and Deck the Halls also, the spirit of Christmas is invoked by the need to erect the biggest, the brashiest, the most ostentatious and expensive adornment of Christmas lights and figurines on the rooftop of the family home. But even if consumerism is rightly deemed integral to these pictures, I would argue that Christmas films are also preoccupied with something that often we don't get much mention of in the world today, which is the exploration of the magical, transformative, even supernatural telos or direction, if you like, of Christmas, whereby characters are shown Scrooge-like to have the capacity to change, albeit against the backdrop of a materialist or consumerist worldview, which is shown to be wanting. We had a lot of this Christmas films of the 1940s, like Christmas in Connecticut, where you have characters whose lives are found to be lacking and dominated by selfish ambitions and so on. And Christmas is the occasion when humanism, as Mark Delancey says, humanism overcomes materialism, disunity gives way to unity, and nearly miraculous reunions are granted to separated families or lovers. Crucially, Christmas is synonymous with change and transformation for the human characters in such festive fare. And the fact that it's all happening against the backdrop of a time of year associated with miracles and celestial otherness only serves to underpin the momentousness of the conversions, the resolutions that are on display. In many cases, the transformation is quite modest. It's about bringing families together during times of crisis and upheaval. A lot of these 1940s films, I'll Be Seeing You, with a clear wartime dimension, that very much comes to the fore there. You have it in Die Hard, you have it in Home Alone as well, where the young Kevin, interestingly, Macaulay Culkin, offers a prayer to Santa in the hope that he will be reunited for Christmas with his estranged family. But the bottom line is that Christmas could not be more concerned with questions of human agency and pertain to this world. Celestial emissaries may be involved in It's a Wonderful Life, as you see there on the right-hand side of the screen. The heavenly angel Clarence is sent to intervene in the life of the suicidal George Bailey. But the film's denouement, indeed the whole sort of raison d'etre of the miraculous intervention in the first place, is to bring about the restoration and the re-establishment of the ruptured family unit. So binaries are completely unsustainable here. So it's all the more ironic that these sort of dynamics take place within a body of films which are characteristically escapist and fantastic in their orientation. I mentioned Jobling earlier, who says that she's not writing about Christmas at all, but she says that in a way we see this in fantasy literature, which is seen to be childish, associated with a number of undesirable features to represent the non-rational. And so fantasy is a commentary on or counterpart to reality. And there is a certain paradox involved, because despite being so tied to questions of familial identity and security and to the bringing together of estranged spouses or fathers at Christmas time, festive films are laden with scenarios and characters which belong to the world of the magical and the illusory. So it's all the more remarkable that such predilections are a mainstay of popular Christmas films when, for sociologists like Steve Bruce, as we've just been identifying, the United Kingdom is now a secular culture with traces of a Christian identity, where secular means a rational worldview without beliefs in supernatural powers. That's a quotation from Abbey Day. So Steve Bruce and others may of course be correct that belief in the supernatural is infantile and out of step with trends in popular culture and secularization, but it still begs the question of why fantasy and magic is so popular. And it comes back to what I was saying about Paul Tillich earlier, who says that an art object that is not highly regarded with regard to quality can still have a profound and, by implication, revelatory effect at the point of involved encounter. Now, I don't think Paul Tillich would have been a great ambassador for Christmas films, and he was very sort of elitist in his own dispositions as to what we high art versus low art. But I think that there's something also in what Rachel Wagner says. She's not talking about Christmas films either. She's talking about virtual reality. But she makes the claim here, which I think can be applied to the present discussion, that religion and virtual reality can be viewed as manifestations of the desire for transcendence, the wish for some mode of imagination or being that lies just beyond the reach of our ordinary lives. So perhaps the idea here that Christmas movies are grounded in a vision of a utopian time and space, akin perhaps even to the New Jerusalem. You've got dysfunctional family relationships often giving way to opportunities for children to bond more with their parents, especially when, as happens in the Santa Claus that you see on the left-hand side there, the father finds his real vocation in life as the champion of children, the bestower of gifts to all households around the world. You've got Tim Allen's hapless and non-committal Scott Calvin learning the value of fatherhood when an unexpected turn of events leads him to metamorphosize into Santa Claus. And the film concludes on the most optimistic, even beatific note imaginable, as a reformed father turns dreams into reality. He dispenses not only tangible gifts, but manages also to overcome the skepticism of the most hardened and uncompromising adults about the truth of subscribing to a belief in a magical and seemingly irrational figure before whisking his son Charlie up in his sleigh for one final spin around the world in his elaborate reindeer-pulled sleigh. So I'd argue that it doesn't seem too far-fetched to see in Christmas films a crystallization of what for audiences amounts to the existence or the presence of the sacred. And certainly the conversion and transformative message that's intrinsic to every Christmas film has long been a staple of the celebration of Christmas. It's what, in a way, it's an extension of what Christmas has meant for centuries. And it's sort of, as Nissenbaum says, it's long served to transfigure our ordinary behavior in an almost magical fashion, in ways that reveal something about what we would like to be, what we once were, or what we are becoming despite ourselves. So to this end, Christmas movies may well be escapist, but that escapism needs to be understood as a means to an end rather than as an end in itself. And even, I don't know if anyone has seen Bad Santa. It's the sort of film that, if I was to show any clips, I don't think I'd find anything that, wasn't full of very, very bad language. I think this is a really bad Santa. He works in a department store, so he can rob it on Christmas Eve. He's somebody. He's let's put it this way. There's nothing philanthropic about him. But even a film like that, where you have the most misanthropic Father Christmas you could imagine, it follows the Scrooge narrative all over. At the end of the day, he does a good turn for somebody else. He's suicidal at one point, but he shows a care for one of the children who really wants to believe in him. This is Father Christmas in this grotto. And even Bad Santa, which is as misanthropic and sort of as challenging and subversive as you can get, turns very formulaic towards the end. I think I would argue that Christmas films are not therefore successful in spite of, but because of their escapist, their diversionary, their trite, let's be honest, dispositions. You see that in all sorts of films. You've got sort of one-dimensional characters. It's almost as though sometimes it's because they're so straightforward and simple. I mean, Trapped in Paradise, which came out in I think released here actually after Christmas, in February or March 1995. I saw it at the cinema, and it was the film that got such bad reviews in America that actually wasn't even released for the Christmas season over here. It sort of came out in February and sort of almost vanished without trace. And in a way, it's a very silly film. Nicolas Cage is in it before his Oscar nominations came flooding through. And it's just quite simply a family, 2 or 3 brothers who want to rob this small town called Paradise over Christmas. And then they go in to rob the town, but they're so overcome by the heartwarming niceness of this community that they decide actually that after they've stolen the money, they want to give it back. It's very trite, it's very silly. No one for a minute is saying that this is sort of going to challenge Dickens and the sort of stakes for sophisticated literature. It's a very trite, simplistic, binary universe where good only can ever prevail. But Christmas movies are replete with one-dimensional characters who attain redemption against the odds. And the further they are from reality, such as with the addition of sleigh rides and angels and pixies and Father Christmas, obviously a staple of Christmas movies, somehow that redemptive arc impacts on audiences, if not on critics, it must be said, more than when the world that's presented is perhaps a little bit too realistic or close to home. So it's kind of all the more ironic that for Rudolf Bultmann, arguably the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, that he took it as a given that to call upon men and women to subscribe to a pre-scientific universe, mythological worldview, was one of the greatest stumbling blocks in Christianity. As he saw it, nobody reckons with direct intervention by transcendent powers, because modern men and women acknowledge as reality only such phenomena or events as are comprehensible within the framework of the rational order of the universe. And his argument was that one of the most famous quotes credited to him is that it's impossible to use electric light and the wireless and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries and at the same time believe in the New Testament world of demons and spirits. And you see similar language in Don Cupid, who wrote in The Sea of Faith, that instead of explaining things in relation to spiritual powers, we explain them by reference to mathematical frameworks and structural regularities. And Christmas with the Cranks is entirely representative of Christmas films for the way in which it is predicated on the existence of a supernatural worldview. The film concludes with a distant shot of the 2 main characters played by Tim Allen and Jamie Lee Curtis, who, as we see them on the rooftop of their family home, we see a CGI snowman taking off his hat, bowing his head, and then Santa and his reindeer flying across the skyline en route to delivering presents to all the children of the world. And I think, ironically, this is a film that both seems to encapsulate Cupid's understanding that traditional forms of religion are increasingly peripheral to modern life and have been displaced by secular agencies, while at the same time it cannot do without the supernatural. Christianity may be paid mere lip service in this film, but it is by no means a secular film. If by secular we mean that as Cupid sees it, we cannot help recognizing infantile fantasies of omnipotence for what they are. and that in our post-Enlightenment age, we no longer subscribe to myths about supernatural redeemers. Now, this film here does not signify that this worldly explanations have triumphed over what Cupid refers to as obsolete religious ideas. I mean, some years ago when I first came across this film, I thought that in a way the film almost comprised the quintessence of the idea that traditional forms of religion are relegated to the margins of life. It's all about Santa, it's not about Jesus. There's just no more than a veneer remaining. But I would argue, I think now, that the supernatural mythological veneer that's integral to this film, even if the Christian religion which once supported such teachings and worldviews is not, is actually what we should be looking at. This is a sort of film where the mythological is integral. Bultmann may have once said that Christianity needed to be divested of its pre-scientific, obsolete cosmology. And the irony is that it is the secular film industry which seems to be so brazenly beholden to it. So rather than dismissing Christmas movies for their fantastic or their escapist predilections, I would argue that Christmas films might be seen to offer one of the most direct challenges to the secularization thesis in the modern world. And so despite the chance premise in The Sacred Santa, that Christmas is a religious festival because of its cosmological and naturalistic ingredients, where emphasis is on the ultimate power of the economy rather than on the supernatural or the transcendental, I would say that Christmas films do suggest that the transcendentalism that the chant is so keen to move away from is central to the modern Christmas celebration. So just in the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, I wanted to sort of have some concluding thoughts here on Christmas and the economy, because even if the backdrop of these pictures tends to be a materialist or consumerist sort of teleology or sort of direction, what comes to the fore in Christmas movies is a surprisingly subversive challenge to the dictates of the market and of consumption, in a way that counters the chance and critical assumption that the economy is late capitalism's ultimate concern. What I think is really interesting here is that at face value, Christmas movies would not seem to be especially adept at supplying a critique of the very rituals of consumption that are one of their most conspicuous characteristics. You've got, for example, the Santa Claus, where Mark Connolly has argued that the sense of a society used to consuming big is obvious by the shot of the street. All the houses are beautifully lit for Christmas and are filled with affluent families. We see all of these things in these films. These are films that seem to be almost the epitome of, as with Deck the Halls, having the biggest, brashiest, most ostentatious display. And so consumerism very much comes to the fore, maybe is the new American religion. But while conceding that films are made for profit, I mean, no Hollywood studio is going to invest capital in a film that has little chance of returning a viable income. It's also a staple of the genre that Christmas films exhibit a certain ambivalence about the role that money plays in the pursuit of Christmas happiness. Very much typified in the 1947 version of Miracle on 34th Street, where you've got Santa Claus saying, for the past 50 years or more, I've been getting more and more worried about Christmas. It seems to me that we're all too busy trying to beat the other fellow and making things go faster and look sharper. Christmas and I are sort of getting lost in the shuffle. So what we have in Christmas films, I think, is an attempt to hold together two potentially disparate and competing dynamics, where, in keeping with Niebuhr's Christ and culture in paradox model that I referred to earlier, according to which Christians are always having to negotiate between these two conflicting demands, between Christian injunctions on the one hand and secular authority on the other. I would say here that this sort of model is predicated on the need to compromise by way of tolerating the norms of a secular culture, which falls short of ideal Christian teachings and values. And the fact that such films, Christmas films, offer a critique of consumerism, while at the same time operating within an environment where capitalism and material acquisition and consumption is normative, is analogous in this respect to Niebuhr's premise that he said man is seen as subject to two moralities. Here the duality may not be predicated quite so explicitly between Christianity and capitalism, but it's firmly rooted in the same way between competing spiritual and material values. And I think that Christmas films tend to offer, if you like, a both and model, whereby faith in Santa and all he represents will be rewarded with prosperity and security. And that maybe Christmas is the vehicle of that promise, an argument that Lee Eric Schmidt has put forward. After all, it's perhaps because of, rather than in spite of, the disenchanting forces of the Enlightenment and a market economy that at the end of a film like Miracle on 34th Street, you see true happiness and indeed magic being attained, with the little girl being given the perfect Long Island home. I think what comes to the fore in Christmas movies is a deceptively subversive and surprisingly complex array of ideological and thematic beliefs and values. Despite seeming at first sight to comprise the apotheosis of Christmas materialism and greed, they function within a context of familial, social, and interpersonal connection and even transformation. Christmas films may be grounded in the consecration of consumption and capitalism, but at the same time, they seem to be sanctifying charity and magic and wish fulfillment. And above all, it's the sacrality of relationships that underpins even the most crass Christmas fare, as typified by Jingle All the Way or Surviving Christmas. So whereas the real economy is predicated on one's financial means, in the respect that provided one has the money, then there's no limit to the number of commodities that can be transacted. The economy that is constructed in celluloid Christmas fantasies is one whereby need and giving and philanthropy and generosity, which are difficult to measure in terms of monetary value, are the overarching determinants in a manner that's perhaps closer to the Christian economy than to the machinations of the real economy. So to this end, Christmas movies represent the opposite, the antithesis of the chance attestation that the capitalist economy is normative. Important though the economy may be at Christmas, a better qualification of the chance position would be to see the economy as a means to an end, namely that of facilitating or giving concrete material expression to the way we conduct and prioritize our family and personal relationships. I think that criticisms of Christmas consumerism and materialism are only really sustainable when that consumerism and materialism constitutes an end in itself, rather than a means towards a more wholesome or edifying or spiritual end. And I think I've put up here All I Want for Christmas from 1991, where you have very rich characters here. It's all about, on the one hand, having a very opulent and splendid and decorative and posh sort of Christmas celebration. But the main characters, the boy and the girl in the film, just want their parents to be reunited. And in the same way that Jingle All the Way may have been slated by critics for its unconvincing attempt at critiquing Christmas consumerism while ultimately endorsing it, but it has also been recognized by some writers as having some integrity in the way that it endorses and sanctifies the importance of familial relationships. It offers an intriguing commentary on parental pressures during the Christmas season, as one critic has noted. And that you have a loving, caring father who wants to demonstrate the love for his son and to show some responsibility. And in an inversion, if you like, of the Scrooge narrative, where a man with wealth chooses not to spend any money on Christmas gifts, the protagonist, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, is swept up in the compulsion to articulate love for his child through the act of shopping. And I think there's something in here. You've got this book by Daniel Miller. It came out in 1994, and he's an anthropologist who did some ethnographical research in London, looking at what was going on, not necessarily at Christmas time, but obviously in terms of the chance model about Christmas being the apotheosis of materialism and consumption and the economy, certainly applies here. And Daniel Miller found that when people go shopping, they're doing it for another, for someone that they love, someone that they're close to. The argument here is that shopping may be a vicarious entry into social relations, in which commodities are used to constitute the complexity of contemporary social relations. The idea is that shopping expresses a relationship between the shopper and a particular other individual, a child or a partner. And it says something about the values to which people wish to dedicate themselves. It's not about how acquisitive or individualistic we may be. So the idea here is that it is love which remains as a powerful, taken for granted, he argues, foundation for acts of shopping. So whereas for Duchamp, the economy is the foundation of our postmodern cares and concerns, it's what Christmas is in itself. Miller, I think, gives us, and the Christmas films, I think, are doing much the same thing, a bit of a qualification of all of this. Of course, selfishness or hedonism may lie at the heart of many people's shopping predilections. But for Daniel Miller, love is not only normative, as you can see on the screen, but easily dominant as the context and motivation for the bulk of actual shopping practice. So material culture can give expression to, rather than to detract from, the relationships that we foster. So the purpose of shopping for Miller is not so much to buy the things people want, but to strive to be in a relationship with subjects that want these things. So shopping, far from being the essence of ungodliness, is, as a ritual, he says, the vestigial search for a relationship with God. So when it comes to Christmas, we can see that based on Miller's thesis, there is more to the festival than the manifestation of sheer materialism and capitalism. Shopping and consumption may continue unabated in a world where competition, material prosperity, and acquisition are normative. But Christmas is as much about the transcendence of impersonal material and market forces as it is about the blind and naked subservience to them. And you see this in Christmas movies. I'm thinking here of the end of Miracle on 34th Street, where the emphasis is actually not so much on making money, but the importance of family and a new family unit that's been formed. Or in Elf from 2003, where not only are an estranged father and son reconciled, but the emphasis at the end of that film is on a community that's united in the Christmas spirit, as Greg Garrett has written at some length, as the seasonal cheer spreads among the crowds gathered in New York's Central Park. So my argument would be that the films themselves may be made for profit, but their narratives are bound up with the importance of generosity, of wonder, of miracles, of joy, of belief, of fellowship, of giving, celebration, community, love, maybe even redemption, because of, rather than in spite of, the rampant acquisitiveness and consumption. And I think that Christmas is a notoriously contested and inscrutable festival, driven by paradox, where all these competing ideologies come to the fore. It's one where a radio program made by the BBC, like Junior Choice, or a crass Christmas movie, can be sneered at by critics for being infantile and lightweight, but may actually engender some of the more profound and sophisticated insights about the real meaning behind the festive season. So, whether or not one is dreaming of a white Christmas or roasting chestnuts on an open fire, Christmas may amount to one of the most unexpected, but I would argue very much fertile manifestations of religion in our time.